thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's conversation with Major General Maria Barrett, a member of the Tufts class of 1988. My name is Jillian Cudney. I'm a first-year student from Dover Plains, New York, and I'm a member of the Air Force ROTC program here on campus. I'm pursuing a degree in environmental engineering, and I'm also a member of the varsity swimming and diving and varsity cross-country teams. Though this year has definitely been different than expected, I've really enjoyed my first year at Tufts, and I'm fortunate enough to be here in Medford on campus to experience it. Although I'm not entirely sure about my Air Force career aspirations just yet, it is thanks to the stories shared by speakers like our guest tonight that I am continually inspired during my ROTC journey. I'd like to thank the Advocates for Tufts ROTC for sponsoring this event. The Advocates for Tufts ROTC was organized in 2005 to encourage continuance, increased enrollment of ROTC participants at Tufts, and work closely with Tufts administration to support military, veteran, and ROTC students and alumni. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by James Glaser, Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. We'll hear about Major General Barrett's storied military career and her journey from second lieutenant in the Tufts Army ROTC program to commanding general of the Network Enterprise Technology Command. Her organization secures, operates, and defends the Army's global enterprise networks. Her 33-year Army career spans from the tactical to strategic levels. A veteran of multiple U.S. military operations, her many awards and decorations include the Defense Superior Service Medal, Legion of Merit, and Bronze Star Medal. Additionally, she will receive an honorary Doctor of Public Service degree at Tufts this year's commencement. Thank you again for supporting ROTC students and programs such as this one. Together, we can bring attention to the extraordinary work our students and alumni are doing both on campus and around the world. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Dean Glaser. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. And General Barrett, Maria, it's a great pleasure to have this time with you. Really looking forward to this conversation. We've come to know each other over the past few years through various events. You've been such a terrific and loyal supporter of Tufts and a great alum. And I have to say that I'm very proud to be associated with you. It is one of the great pleasures of my job to watch our alums go into the world and be successful and attain leadership and make a difference in the world. And there's a lot of alums who we're very proud of, but I must admit that I am particularly proud that you are a jumbo. So I've got a whole lot to ask you about. It's such a there's quite a lot to discuss, and we've also collected some questions from the community, which I've incorporated into my interview, and so I think we should just get started. And so I want to start with some discussion of your career path, how it started, how it evolved over time, and then talk more about ROTC, about the military, and also about the particular challenges and opportunities of being a woman in the military. So I wonder if you might just be able to start us off with a little story about your path. Maybe start at the very beginning or early on. I understand that your brother dubbed you and your sister, who also has attained the role of general, as leadership junkies. And so I'm kind of wondering what he meant by that. What did he see? And how did that manifest itself as you were growing up?
Yeah, so thanks. First of all, thanks, Jim. And you know, you talk about being proud of the alums that go out into the world and make a difference. But, you know, I think this is a two-way street. I'm equally proud to be associated with Tufts. And I mean that. It's got a great reputation of being a part of solutions. And I think that aspect of Tufts was appealing to me when I was looking at colleges. And as I graduated and look back, and as I come back as an alum, it's continued on through successive presidents. And so I think that's something that is core to Tufts and, you know, should be cherished. So you mentioned the sibling rivalry piece, or leadership junkies, as my brother calls it. My brother has a very excellent sense of humor. And as a former journalist, he's really good with getting a quotable quote into the newspaper. So he succeeded. What I think my brother was looking at, there were 5 kids in our family. They were kind of the older 3. There's about 7 to 10 years difference between them and my younger sister and I. And I think what my brother saw was that both my sister and I were pretty, we were engaged, whether it was on our own initiative, getting a paper route as kids. We weren't content to play in the backyard, but we were going to go get our own, we were going to go put money in our own piggy bank and go do that. And we did it, and the paper route grew. Or when we got into high school, playing on the soccer team and both being leaders on the soccer team, or some of the other sports that we did, or with our own studies. And so I think that's really where maybe my brother saw something that he didn't necessarily. I honestly think my older 3 siblings, were great in high school in and of themselves, but he sees it a little bit differently. So I think that's fine. But we were engaged, and I actually think this is more of a reflection of maybe our parents, both public servants, and my mother was very active in the community. Once she gave up teaching to have a family, she was still involved with the church or the library or things like that. And I don't know if we maybe took our cues out of that, you had a purpose, and your purpose was not just to idly sit around and, I don't know, watch soap operas after school. You were supposed to do something with the gifts that you were given, and whatever they were, whether it was athleticism or whether it was academic, you were supposed to do something with them. And maybe that's part of, I think all of us in the family got it. I don't think my sister and I are exception to that. But I like that he was celebrating our achievements.
Your dad was a World War II vet, correct?
Yes, he was. And it's interesting, while I knew that, he did not talk about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the reason he didn't talk about it is, if you were a male and you did not participate in World War II, that was a source of, for whatever reason, only male child, a medical reason. That was not something that you really advertised. And a couple of his friends in town did not participate in World War II. And so he never talked about his service. So while I knew he was in World War II, I did not know about his achievements. He earned the Silver Star, and I did not know that until he passed. And actually, I was an ROTC cadet, and I was at MIT, and I was I think I was an okay ROTC cadet. I wasn't particularly good at marching. I probably didn't have an excellent command voice back in those days. Building rope bridges was kind of new to me, which was a requirement when you went to advanced camp in the Army. They kind of like rope bridges. I'm being a little bit sarcastic here, but my MS3 instructor came in, who was kind of a scary major back in those days, and he came in and he started talking about, in really these laudatory terms, about father. And I actually had to go look at the obituary to see what he was talking about. And that's how much my father did not talk about his service. And so when I saw that, it was, whoa. And I had to ask my mother more questions about my father's service and what had he earned the Silver Star for. And so we might want to connect those things in terms of, you come from a military family. We don't. We do come from a family that understands service, and honestly, my father he got his citizenship by going into the service. He was an immigrant from Italy and went down to Fort Dix and enlisted and went back to his home country, his native country, to fight on its soil. And I think, sometimes when I was sitting in a history class at Tufts, I would think about, how do you go back to your native nation and fight on its soil, fight perhaps your own former countrymen, and how difficult that might be. And unfortunately, I was never able to ask my father those questions.
Oh, that's so interesting. My wife's uncle was a Japanese American young man in the camps, in the internment camps, volunteered for the U.S. Army and served in Italy. And he didn't come home. But last year, or before the pandemic, 2 years ago, we went to the mountainous area where the 442nd were stationed, where they fought, and identified some of those places. It really was a very meaningful thing to experience that. Yeah. So you said that you don't really think of your upbringing as a military upbringing, but yet you did sign up. You did join ROTC, and you've said that the reason that you joined was not the reason that you stayed. And so I'm sort of interested in the reason that you joined, and then I'm interested in the reason that you stayed.
Yeah. So, being the fourth of 5 children on a public servant's salary, I felt like I had an obligation to my parents to try to figure out how to pay for, a really great school. So my original plan was, I wanted to be a foreign service officer, so the international relations degree from Tufts, maybe go on to graduate school, join the foreign service, and eventually, again, get to that leadership role of career ambassador. That was the plan, and we all map out these plans, right? In very detail. We know exactly what we want to be when we grow up. But so ROTC and joining the Army for the 4-year obligation, after that, if I got a scholarship, was the way to an end. And that was, foreign service and career ambassador in the State Department. What ended up happening was you find out that in my case, I found out that I had a passion for this. I had a passion for leading soldiers, and I had a passion for defending the nation. I think that passion was true to my original plan, which was joining the foreign service, because that is the service of the nation and diplomatically defending our interests, right? And now I'm in the military, and I'm doing it in a different way, not closely related to what the original plan was, but I'm doing it, and it has meaning. I was as a lieutenant, probably only my 2nd year of service, and I'm stationed in Germany. We end up deploying to Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Mm-hmm. And I think the deployment was a way of bringing into focus, hey, just trying to use the Army to gain leadership experience and pay back this scholarship, the ways to the end. That's not a really good purpose. And when you're deployed and you have soldiers' lives in your hands and you have a mission to do, and there are other people counting on you, you find your purpose. And then all of that other reasoning fell away. So the reason why I joined probably left my mind somewhere during that deployment, and where the reason why I stayed took over. Because that piece of leading soldiers in a combat environment, in an area of hostility, is pretty serious stuff. And the amount of responsibility that you have, the decisions that you have to make at that very young age, and you find out that you make these decisions really well, and you bring everybody back, and it's a successful mission, and you go, okay, what else can I do? On this journey of leading soldiers and defending our nation, I think that's where the pivot point probably was, where it became less transactional, and more purpose driven.
Well, a lot of people do this. At one point, you had to have made a decision, a purposeful decision to really stay for the long haul. Is it that you just started experiencing success and being asked to do more and more? Was there a moment where you said, I'm really going to make a full career of this?
There was a discussion between my husband and I. At the time, we were dating and discussing getting married. And we were asking things about, things that a couple should talk about. How many kids? Where do you want to live? Money. Is money important to us? And as we were talking about these things, one of the things we talked about was military. Do we stay with this once we're done with our 4-year obligation? Because he had an obligation as well. And so we said, well, we're not really sure that we want to make this a career. But let's go ahead and well, we can do our 4 years and then we can decide after that. And what happens after 4 years is, they send you back for more training. And then they give you responsibility of a company, and you become a company commander. And that in and of itself is more responsibility. And so what I think, it was not a deliberate decision, to answer your question directly, Jim, short answer up front. But I think what it was, really taking advantage of promising situations as we went along. And that's okay. I actually believe that maybe this was fine the way that we did it, because taking advantage of promising situations again, is versus following a plan. It's almost like a chessboard, right? If somebody moves a piece in front of you, you've got to come up with another move. And but you can still achieve checkmate. And I think that's okay. And that's what I believe we ended up doing, is we just continually did another assessment and another assessment. And the Army kept affording us, and myself, I'll talk to myself, affording us great opportunities, like, working at the White House Communications Agency, or, again, deploying back into the theater as a commander, as a colonel. And, that's a tremendous lot of responsibility. I've got more people underneath me, going to cyber command. All those things I could not have planned out for myself had you told me to, hey, tell me where you're going to be in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. That was not that. Although if you think back to it being a freshman at Tufts, I had a perfect plan, Army, graduate school, foreign service officer, career ambassador, done. And so this plan worked, this non-plan actually worked out pretty well.
Yeah. I often say to students, if you'd have told me when I was a college student that I would have the career that I have had, I would have been bewildered. I didn't know what deans did or what deans were. But as I look backwards, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. But the goal never changed, which was service, and I wanted to serve at a,
Yeah.
I had it already an orientation towards a level. That was my passion.
Yeah.
In some ways I did deviate from the plan. But in some ways I stuck to it as well.
So one of the pre-submitted questions, and actually there were a couple of pre-submitted questions that wanted to connect your experience at Tufts to your experience in the Army, and this question was framed actually very nicely. How did your experience at Tufts inform your approach to leadership in the Army?
Yeah, so it's interesting because that true north of really looking at what our national interests were through the lens of international relations and preparing to be a diplomat has come into play. Maybe not at the more junior levels of being in the service, but it did. You start to get some insight into some of these things. So, working at the White House Communications Agency, and at the time it was during the Bush presidency, 2002 to 2007. So a very dynamic time. You got to have a front seat at how decision makers make their decisions at that level and supporting them. Understanding the criticality of what you're doing. And another part of my job while I was at the White House Communications was also ensuring that the president could communicate at any given time with certain world leaders. And so there was a significant amount of travel in my job. And I had breakfast at 10 Downing Street. I could not have written that into the plan had you told me, Jim, that I was doing that. And there were other unique experiences like that. And you really understand where so I am influencing this piece probably a little bit later on, when I'm working at Cyber Command and we're dealing with how to counter ISIS in cyberspace. And I'm now working, this is not just an IT problem. This is also about, how do we work with our coalition partners and, defining the problem, in how best to literally and figuratively attack the problem that was causing a great threat. So you do start to pull on things that you have seen or been experienced while you were at Tufts. And I took no IT classes at Tufts. But this is where, in my career, you start to pull on a wide range of ideas in order to come up with a plan. And I do think that my varied experience was actually an asset to me in applying IT to a non-IT problem.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about ROTC. The ROTC program here is small, but it's very fine, and the students who participate in it, I think, are enriched by it, and we're enriched by them. I wonder if you could talk about your experience as a Tufts student. Actually, there was a question that came in, so I'm gonna read the question verbatim as it came to us, because it's a good one. Please discuss your experience as a Tufts student participating in the ROTC unit at MIT. Were your Tufts classmates sometimes surprised or confused when they saw you in the uniform on the Tufts campus? Well, then there's an editorial comment that was the reaction I often got when I wore my Navy midshipman uniform on campus and we attended Tufts at the same time. I sometimes felt like I had a dual or secret identity. Did you ever feel that way?
Yeah, I did. And Jim, you and I talked about this on one of my first trips back to Tufts, and I love the way that you put it. You said that it wasn't that that the campus didn't welcome the wearing of the uniform; it just didn't embrace it. And the hope was that, as you know, perhaps as we became more aware of what our service members were doing over the past 20 years, that had changed. But I still think that so my experience as an ROTC cadet was fine. I wear my uniform down to the bottom of Memorial Steps, pick up the van to go into MIT, and go do the additional classes that we did as part of the ROTC program. My roommates knew what I was doing, and so they were pretty familiar with it. What ended up happening, though, was as I developed friendships with some of my fellow cadets from MIT, Harvard, and Wellesley at the time, we started to do more things together. And I had one of my friends ask me one time, well, why are you going to spend time with them? Like, because they're my friends. And it is possible to have friends in this group of people. They are people after all. And it's almost like how it is today. We talk about our families and we talk about our military family. There's this other world that we do belong to, and we are just as close to them. It's not work, it's a profession. And we are very close. So but campus life was good as a cadet. I don't remember it being bad, but I do remember maybe a couple, oh, there's a person in uniform. It was unusual. We were not great numbers. I actually think you have stronger numbers now than back in 1988. I do think one time I had a discussion with one of my professors who's still there. And I was in his class, and I think I mentioned it to him. And I think my brother, having missed the draft by 1 year, was always very concerned that perhaps my professors would not treat me fairly if they knew I was in the military. And given the fact that I was taking a lot of political science courses and things of that nature, they might have very strong feelings because they all came out of that generation. And I mentioned it to this particular professor, and he recounted to me a story which immediately put me at ease that he did not judge me for participating in ROTC. And so that kind of taught me something too about making assumptions. Here my brother was afraid of people making assumptions about me if they saw me in uniform. And I was in turn applying the same assumption on my professor that he might judge me unfairly without giving him a chance. And so at that point, you kind of just have to relax. I'm doing this and own it. And let's have a conversation about it. And if we have a conversation, I might find out that actually my professor does support this. And if he doesn't, that's okay too. But I was being unfair too in terms of judging him.
Well, that's an interesting story. I think on our campus now, where service is such an important part of the campus ethos, and of course with Tisch College here, and I think a recognition that the military is sort of the ultimate form of public service and contributes so much to so many different things. I do think it's a friendlier place than it was. Yeah. I don't know that it was ever that it was an unfriendly place in the early 90s. I do think it was an unfriendly place 20 years before that. But the times have changed.
Yeah.
And it's
I don't think it was unfriendly,
yeah,
but it was probably a little bit too close to a period of time where that was still
right.
very much in the back of our minds. I was reminded by my brother, there might be some article in the Tufts Observer about, bringing ROTC back on campus, and you got to see the debate play out in the newspaper. And so you're kind of in the middle of that going, where do I belong? And again, we're making our decision. I just had to relax and own it. And it just took a little bit, probably more for me to get comfortable with it and stop worrying about everybody else.
Right. Yeah, that one of the touch points about for people who were on campus in the 60s and 70s was a faculty vote to banish ROTC from campus. Maybe 10 years ago, I brought a piece of legislation to the floor of the faculty where we voted to embrace ROTC on our college transcripts, and that was the first faculty vote about ROTC. We won that vote pretty handily, and that was the first faculty vote about ROTC in like 40 years or something like that.
Wow.
But it's one that we're proud of, and I think it sort of marks a sort of new time for ROTC on our campus. One of the questions that's come in has to do with the ROTC program and how you now view the ROTC program from your perspective as a military leader, and how well ROTC prepares the cadets and midshipmen, the cadets in the case of the Army, and then how they compare with the junior officers who are prepared at West Point. Do you see any difference at all?
Wow, I could get into some analysis about that I'm privy to in terms of recruiting and retention. This is something that we look at all the time in terms of what's more effective, and there's a place for both. There's a slight on the retention side of the house, we appear to retain more officers who come through the ROTC program, ironically, than from the academies. And while we might see a number of Army senior leaders who came through the academy, I'm not sure if I have seen the last statistics on where we're at right now. But in terms of the quality of the officers, really a lot is going to depend upon when you get into your unit and you start doing for real, with a platoon of soldiers. How effective are you? How fast do you learn? When you fail, how quickly do you get up? And what do you take forward from that failure and adapt as a leader? And I don't think you can start to really do that until, I don't care whether you come through the academy or you come through ROTC, you learn by living. And I don't think you really get a good sense of who's going to be successful. Because when you get to your organization, we can train you in the basic leadership things that you will encounter. But the rest, we're going to then train you on your specialty when you go to the basic course, whether it's going to be a medical or infantry or signal like me. And then you have to go out and do it and put the technical together with the leadership. And I think, I'm not sure there's a particular trend in terms of who's more successful than another or who's more prepared. Somebody coming out of the, MIT ROTC program, and also I'll be inclusive of all the schools in the greater Boston area that are included in that now. They're all fantastic schools. You're all super smart. as are the cadets coming out of West Point. There is a significant amount of rigor. We see this usually highlighted during the Army-Navy game, right? What these students playing on the football field also have to contend with in terms of keeping up their academics. And so the rigor is there. And especially with this audience, the rigor is there in who's coming out of these ROTC programs. The difference is going to be what happens when you hit the ground and how well you adapt. And I'm not sure I could say that one is better than the other.
Interesting. You made reference to the fact that your Tufts education did not include computer science, I don't believe, and yet here you are responsible for Cyber Command. I wonder if you could talk about your current role. Tell us a little bit about the day-to-day. What are some of the issues that you deal with? What are some of the specific challenges that you face? Yeah.
So I will go back to the no computer training or no computer classes. So I did take an economic statistics course at Tufts at the urging of one of my other professors. And I'm not sure why he told me to do that, because it was the most painful course I had ever taken. I do remember that course today. When somebody puts some data in front of me, I can be very thoughtful about that based on having this statistics course. But we did have to write a computer program. It was a pretty basic one to do the statistics. And I just remember the two dreaded words, syntax error. So yeah, so what I do today, the good news is the Army trains you for what they put you into, and then you have to make a commitment to lifelong learning, and especially in a technological field like mine, this is a constant thing to stay up with, and so it, I am never bored in my business. But what I do today is I operate and defend the Army's networks. I do this with staff, command and staff of about 15,000 people. The annual budget is about $1.2 billion. We span 20 countries. We have 1.4 million users in the Army network, about 14,000 last count of software. And meanwhile, we're also trying to integrate the new technologies. Let's migrate to the cloud. Let's employ data science in how we do our business. Are we going to adopt artificial intelligence and machine learning, 5G technologies? And so while I take care of a lot of infrastructure that is spread globally through those 15,000 people operating and maintaining and defending that network against our adversaries, we're also at the same time trying to incorporate these new technologies into this this infrastructure. And so it's a tremendous responsibility, and I have a great team helping me through this. And so it's a fantastic time to be a communicator in the Army.
I'm going to follow up with a question from Patrick Cassidy, who's a relatively recent alum and somebody we're very proud of. Patrick asked, you have a vast background in cybersecurity and military communications technology more generally, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on the hurdles the military faces in leveraging commercial cloud-based software applications that it may be able to benefit from.
Yeah. We recognize that our industry partners are key, and that this technology is key to being able to operate and defend at speed in this area. The advantages of doing this in the cloud is that we recognize that from a cybersecurity standpoint, it absolutely can be a powerful advantage. So that's why currently The Army has accelerated its move to Office 365 in the cloud. We have a presence in a couple of other clouds, predominantly AWS and some other cloud providers as well, mostly to do some of the, I wouldn't call those general purpose cloud environments, but the Office 365 is general purpose for us because that's what, most of the 1.4 million soldiers, contractors, and civilians in the Army do at their desk every day when they actually interface with their computer. But the issue that we are seeing, and which we will continue to have to remain vigilant about, is as we see from the SolarWinds incident. If Patrick is, I'm sure he's familiar with that, is the supply chain of anything that we use. We can talk about hardware, and now we're seeing on the software side of the house that we also have to think about what is the process by which we obtain our software, how we build our software. Can we use some of the public libraries that are out there for coding, or should we think through a different way of doing that? And so this is something, it's not something my organization is working on. We actually have an enterprise cloud management office for the Army that's focused on this because it is very important. And so it's important to have them fenced and focused on this piece alone. They have the expertise to do that in-house. We have some expertise in my command, but it's not to the scope and scale that we would need in order to really deal with this at the Army level. But it is something that we take very seriously because, if you're, just because you're moving into more systems that are software driven, that then is the underpinning of, what you're doing. You have to take the cybersecurity of it pretty seriously.
Did COVID affect Cyber Command at all, and in what way? And did you have to pivot at all?
Yeah, I mean, for my command in the Army, we had a little bit of an advantage, Jim, because we were able to see, I have a unit that is in Korea. And so they were already starting to deal with it very early on, back in January. So it was in the news that this was happening in China and Wuhan and South Korea. And as I saw what my unit in Korea was doing and what kind of capabilities they needed in order to protect the force and also to maintain the mission while trying to do either telework or, spread out a little bit more. So we knew what capabilities were going to be critical if this was to spread. I think the big wake up call for me was I have a unit in Italy. And when I saw that Italy was starting to have an issue in and around Vincenzo, where my unit is, I told the team here, stand up a crisis action team, start putting together all the things we know about what Korea is doing, and then how would we apply this at scale? Where are the weak points? Where are we going to have gaps, or where are we going to have a bottleneck in terms of capabilities like virtual private networking capabilities, conference bridges, things of that nature. What tools do we have in our kit bag right now? They might not be the optimal tools, and they weren't. But how do we use what we have if all of a sudden the Department of Defense goes on full-scale telework? And I think we probably had about a 4-week jump on the decision by the Department of Defense to go to telework we kind of draw a line at 6 March as the date where it got pretty serious. But we had a CAT team, working for about 6 weeks prior to that. And so when, the Army leadership asked, when my bosses asked, hey, what do we have? We could rattle off, this is what we have. This is what we don't have. And we can start working on that piece. And so the challenge for us my team was, how do I protect my workforce that also has to be a real enabling piece of getting people out to telework? And could we do our mission remotely, to enable the rest of the Army? And I think we did a pretty good job. It was hard at first, but it did also bring into focus some of the things that we need to think about doing, like let's accelerate to the cloud. This had been on our roadmap for, a couple of years, and we were starting to execute it, but it was going slow. And this gave us some purpose to move out faster, because we also see that this is maybe a way of doing business that we hadn't considered before, being the new normal. I will bring more people back to work eventually, but I also think this has opened up the aperture from a retention and recruiting standpoint, that I probably, my organization and my supervisors have probably left talent on the table because they weren't ready to accept a telework arrangement or a partial telework arrangement. And now we're kind of scratching our head going, yeah, I'm not sure that holds up anymore, because we've been doing it for the last year. Right. Unless you're working with classified material on a daily basis, 8 hours a day, it really is a very hard argument for me to support that we can't do telework.
Yeah, so. Let's do. Same thing. We have a question from an individual who says, who asks, you mentioned your job is protecting the Army network from adversaries. How is that role changing with the increase in domestic terrorism? And then follows up with a very important question: who is your favorite roommate at SOBC?
My all right. I thought it was going to be a strange question until
I think the first question is a serious question. The second question is a serious question too, but
so there are actually limits to how we deal with domestic terrorism for the Department of Defense. There's a thing called posse comitatus, and this isn't our role. Right now, this is a law enforcement issue in terms of whether or not we can see extremism activities inside the borders of the United States. However, I would say that the military as a whole, and the Secretary of Defense, has taken on the idea of, hey, there is acceptable behavior in our ranks, and there is not acceptable behavior in our ranks. Whether we're talking about sexual assault and harassment, whether we're talking about toxic leadership, whether we're talking about people who may be, associating with groups that that are considered extremist, and so we're having to go through, and actually, this is more of a leadership issue and not a cyber issue for us, in terms of making sure that everybody understands why is it that we're doing what we're doing. First of all, there's a Constitution in the United States, to defend our nation, and then there's acceptable behavior, and making sure that everybody knows what the standard is, and then holding them to it. I do think this is a difficult challenge. As somebody who has looked at, and I know the comparisons are always a danger zone to make, but as somebody who has studied ISIS and how that extremism grew from some of the isolated areas that it was blooming in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, to lone wolf attacks in France and other areas of Europe, and how the recruitment managed to take people who had never been exposed to the Muslim faith and they find themselves in Syria, when you start looking at how that transpires and how it happened over time, you do, it is a word of caution. I'm not likening this issue to exactly what I've studied with ISIS, but if you're not careful, it can grow and metastasize to a point where it's very hard to roll it back without some very severe actions. And so I would hate to see that get to that point. And so at least from a military standpoint, the people in our ranks, civilians and the uniformed folks, we're going to start by making sure that they know what the difference is between, an extremist organization and one that isn't. So I'm not sure I answered your question, Diane.
We can't let you go without asking about being a woman in the leadership of the military. About 16% of the military's 1.3 million active service, active duty personnel are women. And I believe it's the leadership is even more male dominated. What is it like being a high ranking woman in the military? And do you think that there are any advantages to being a woman as you are dealing with some of the more contemporary issues that the military is facing?
So in terms of what it's like being a woman in the military, my way of going about being in the military was I downplayed my gender. I did not want to be, I wanted to let my abilities speak for themselves, right? I didn't want people to view me as a woman. I wanted them to see me as a competent officer, as a competent signal officer, and a competent leader. And so this is again about, why am I here? My purpose isn't here to prove a point as a woman, although I would say that there was probably a little bit of that in me back in college, where I was going to take the highest, tallest, steepest hill. Because I was a woman, I had something to prove. And in fact, when if you were to take my preference sheet of branches, I was actually thinking about putting field artillery at the top of my list, because back in those days, long range ballistic missiles, you could have women in those ranks. And when I talked to somebody about that, they said, field artillery, it's really not a good place for women. And I said, why? And they said, every time and I was talking to another woman, I get trained on this weapon system, all of a sudden they ban it. And if you think back to the late 80s, that's what we were doing in Europe. We were taking a lot of these long range weapon systems and we were writing treaties that were now banning the systems. So women all of a sudden found no place for them in field artillery and eventually had to rebranch. Okay, we've moved on and we now allow women into combat branches, but Jim, it goes back to my reason was I had something to prove as a woman. I'm going to go field artillery and I'm going to blow things up. That's the wrong reason, And so there's a theme here. The reason why I joined isn't the reason why I stayed. I went towards a branch that actually would allow me to achieve my potential as a leader. And so I went to the signal branch because I talked to some women there and they had great opportunities that they were being allowed to do and they were happy. And I'm like, that sounds like a good deal for me, especially since I didn't plan on making it a career. So after that, I kind of jettisoned the whole women thing. And it was just stop worrying about proving something to who? To me? Or to somebody else? Let's just this is a very serious business, Desert Storm. I have very serious responsibilities and I have to be the best leader that I can be. And so I basically parked that piece. And in fact, if I walked into a room full of men and I was the only woman in the room, usually there were times where it was somebody else had to point it out to me. That, hey, did you know you were the only woman in the room? Oh, actually, no, I didn't. At that point, I don't know whether it was because I had brothers growing up and I was very comfortable, or I had just parked this so well that I didn't really feel like, I didn't feel any challenge to doing this. I didn't feel like it was difficult being a woman. I didn't feel like it was easier being a woman. I felt like I was an officer being challenged, and I was stepping up to those challenges, and I was, part of a team. And so it's really not until you start to step into, the higher level command roles where people start asking you, hey, can you come speak at, Women's History Month? And all of a sudden you go, okay, I now have to find my voice and talk about what it's like to be a woman. And certainly at this level. And my sister and I, once she was promoted, we also kind of had to, hey, what is it that we want to say about this? And I do realize that even though I was very comfortable in this male-dominated environment, and that my mentors were male, my role models were mostly male. For the better part of my career, a couple of females started popping up a little bit later in my career. But I realized that that's not everybody's orientation, and that sometimes somebody does want to see somebody like them to talk to inspire them, to identify with. And so I do accept that that there is a reason why we seek to have a diverse organization. I think the latter part of the question that you asked, though, was, do you feel like there's any advantage to being a female? And I don't know if I would call it an advantage. I think I'd go back to diverse organizations are ones that are the most productive because they bring another point of view. It's kind of like, do you remember when Tufts roomed everybody according to their social security numbers? That was my year. And so all of a sudden people found themselves rooming with, somebody they went to high school with, or somebody from the same state. That's not what our experience is supposed to be in the learning environment. And when we're all the same and we come from the same perspective, the same town, Hill Hall was the Massachusetts dorm. That limits your experience that you came to college to have. And so I think I wouldn't frame it as an organization, but there are things that maybe I bring to the game as a woman, the way that I might think, the way that I coach, teach, and mentor, that might be different from somebody else. And I think and so the other person learns from me and I learn from them, and we all win. And so I don't think it's an advantage. I just think that it's part of a healthy team.
That's great. I just have to ask one last question, which is, are there any other sister combinations in the, or I imagine there's some brother combinations, sister combinations, but are there any other sister combinations in the leadership of the military?
I don't think there are any more right now. Brothers have popped up. I knew that a couple of years ago when my sister came up on the list. I think the other amazing stories are the husband-wife teams. There are a couple 3-stars. Lieutenant General Laura Richardson and her husband is also a 3-star, and they've had a family. And I admire the fact that somehow they have continued to achieve great levels of success in very challenging jobs. And she's been nominated to go be a combatant commander at Southern Command in Miami and achieve her fourth star. And I think for a couple to make it through their career like that. So the married couples, I think, are even more sensational, to tell you quite honestly, than the sisters are. Although I don't think we have another pair yet.
Well, I
But
imagine you're the
I don't
first.
think it's that far away.
You must be the first. It's an extraordinary thing, and I'm really proud that a Tufts alum, that a jumbo is part of that combination. That's really fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, we could go on. We could go on and on. I know, but we're limited in our time, and so
Oh,
thank
and
you.
there's Jillian.
Yeah, Jillian's keeping us on time.
Hello again. Alrighty, thank you again to advocates for Tufts ROTC, especially Gresh Lattimore and Linda Dixon, as well as Dean Glaser, a continuous supporter of the Tufts ROTC program, and of course our special guest, Major General Maria Barrett. Congratulations again on your upcoming honorary Doctor of Public Service degree, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.